Thank you. Thank you, Samfillah, and thank you, TPI, for inviting me here and hosting a lecture by me. But rather than seeing it as a lecture, I would prefer to see it as some ideas of mine, and then I would like more interaction. So you could ask me a question, or you could give your views, and we can have a discussion around the themes that we raise. And the topic I had suggested was that basic changes within China. So it's quite vague. Changes within China and significance for Tibetans. So what I'm going to do is, in my talk, I'll focus more on what are the changes taking place within China without necessarily talking about Tibet. Because then during question answer, we could focus more on Tibet. So I thought that it would be rather, because when we discuss Tibet, often we discuss only Tibet or Tibet and China vis-a-vis Tibet. But it's quite important to understand the power that colonizes us. I use the word us, including, let's say in case of Tibet, right? From the power that colonizes us. Now, when Xi Jingping came to power, we had a conference here 2 years ago almost, or 1.5 years ago. And similar kind of conferences took place on Xi Jinping's leadership, the potential of it. Not only here. I remember I participated in similar kind of conferences in Belgium, in Australia, in UK and US. Everyone was wondering what changes will take place with new leadership, the new generation. And broadly speaking, not all, but most scholars seem to have some positive hope or some positive view that maybe things will change for better. And even in conference here, I remember in this very location, within CTA, some speakers had given hope that, look, Xi Jinping's father used to wear watch gifted by His Holiness, his wife had some Buddhist connection, and all those things were sort of seen as straws of hope that we clutch in order to give ourselves some sense that maybe things will change for better. Now, 1.5 years or 2 years on, the change, when we notice it, my analysis is, and I'm open to being challenged on that, the change we notice is largely either nil or negative. Now, the hope was in the West specifically. There was a lot of hope of economic reforms. Remember, when we talk of economic reforms, we essentially mean privatization, more opportunity for foreign direct investment. Economic reform does not mean making lives of the people better. It means making lives of the capitalists better. But so long as China opens up its economy, makes sure that Western businesses benefit from it, and the other way around, the West would be quite happy with China. They would keep talking of reform. So what makes Deng Xiaoping reformist is, of course, the fact that he opened up the economy. The fact that there was no political reform is unimportant. Similar kind of character so far we have seen with Xi Jinping. So economic reforms are taking place. Privatization, but only to some extent, by the way. Because there's a state, as you know, state industries still play a very crucial role there. Now, even when you have Huawei, for instance, electronic company which is private, it's not state. Yet, some of you may know, the head of Huawei, the founder head, is ex-PLA. Now, that doesn't mean ex-PLA means he's PLA, but it implies that he has that connection and that network. In China, in order to rise up, you need networks. Who do you know? So I know you, you know him. If you are important, then you will help him and he will help me. If you don't know us, you'll be out. So the fact that he or his company goes on from being scratch to a multi-billion company would not happen without contacts in the government. And his contacts comes largely through his PLA background. So even with private companies, we see a crucial role played by state actors directly or indirectly. But economic changes have taken place in China, and they are taking place. Again, I don't know what's the figure now, maybe 7%, 9%. These figures might impress investors, but it doesn't impress someone like me because it doesn't mean much. Even in India, for instance, figures may increase, but it could only be that maybe Ambanis and the Tatas and the Birlas, they make 10 times more profit. And because they hold so much of wealth, overall economy would seem like it has improved. But majority of people might suffer because of inflation and lower wages. Right? So economic changes are taking place. Second social change people hoped was young people are there, young people who watch, okay, they don't watch YouTube that much, but they're not so much of communists, they don't even know who Mao was as such. And therefore, with social change, social media, gradually young people would protest and they will not accept authoritarian rule. There's a notion that young people are anti-authoritarian, rebels. That's a common view and perception. That when we are young, then we like to break things, we like to shout. As we get old, we get bored, and we give up. That's a common phenomenon. That older people are seen as conservatives, younger as more dynamic and someone who challenge system. To some extent, that's true. So when we look at Arab Spring, the initial part, when it was hopeful and struggle for democracy, it was largely young people who led it. But young people can also be very regressive and be closer to what can be seen as fascism. So young people can also be very prejudiced against minorities. They can be deeply nationalist, and they can be those who would prevent the government from compromising on anything. A good example of that could be in India, where you see majority of young people from whatever demography of vote comes did vote for a party that is clearly anti-minority. Why? Not because young people are necessarily anti-minority. So no, many people who voted for BJP, right, they didn't vote because they hate Muslims or they hate Christians. Because they believe that this party will bring great glory to India, and India will become stronger. It will, I don't know what it will do, but achhe din aayenge, the good days will come, bullet train will come, and maybe few people will travel from Ahmedabad to Bombay, and the rest can go to wherever they have to go to. But that is also a certain kind of young youth culture, a very self-focused, self-obsessed, deeply nationalistic culture. Something similar is in China also. So where people had hoped that social change would mean young people who would protest against authoritarianism, what they ignore is young people might want more authoritarianism, as we saw in case of Cultural Revolution. During Cultural Revolution, a lot of young people were very active in destroying things. So something in this case is they could be very active in anti-Japan protests, anti-Vietnam protests, and very nationalistic. So in that sense, social change does not necessarily imply change for the better. The third kind of change in case of China was, or China hope was, look, China is emerging power. It is the second largest important country in the world today. It's likely to become most important power in a couple of decades. Now China wants to be liked. It wants to be part of international community, and therefore China has no option but to play by the rules of international law. So what would China do? China would make sure that it doesn't go out of way to suppress human rights, because it would not want to be criticized by the international community. Right? So global power, emerging power, would like to be liked by all. Now what we have seen with China is, yes, they want to be liked by all. Well, not by all, but they want to be liked. But they would not compromise on what they see as fundamental interests. What we have seen is human rights is important. So China makes sure that it joins Human Rights Commission and tries to destroy human rights from within. Now it doesn't give up on human rights. It talks of human rights. But it says, well, who is not violating human rights? US also violates human rights. Who is the US to talk of human rights? And many people, let's say including the West, agree with that. That who is the West, who is the US to talk of human rights, given what it did in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and what it's doing or not doing in Gaza. So this kind of rhetoric works very well. So China, what has happened is, as it emerges and it's becoming emerging power, it is playing by international rules. It is playing by rules set by the US, which is you talk of rights when it suits your interest, you give up on rights when it doesn't suit your interest. When it's your ally who's abusing rights, you support it. When it's your enemy who's creating problems, then you oppose it. So clearly the Western international system has been based on hypocrisy. China is following that. It is very much Western in that context. Now, of course, China, so it's doing that. But second thing it's also doing is taking existing international institutions, not calling for overthrow. It's not saying let's overthrow IMF or UN. It says no, let us play with UN. but we will veto when it suits our interest. And as you know, the country that has vetoed most resolutions of United Nations Security Council is the US. And most of the vetoes are on Israel. So all countries in the world will say something and one country will veto, that would be US. So when China vetoes, when it suits its interest, internationally it's very difficult for someone to challenge it by saying, well, China is being hypocritical. Because China is following the international norm of big powers trying to dominate small powers. In this case, therefore, what we have seen with, as China has become global power, it's playing by the rule and playing by the hypocrisy of the rules. Secondly, it's taking existing institutions and subverting them and using them, so when it suits its interests. So this notion that as it emerges, it will become more responsible doesn't hold true so far. And of course, the leadership change, as I said, leadership is always there. And part of the reason we focus a lot on leadership, especially let's say when those of us who study Tibet and outsiders, because we don't know what Chinese system is. No one knows how Chinese leaders think. I don't think even Xi Jingping knows how others think, because as you know, this is not an open system. So you cannot analyze, you cannot do a proper study. There will be no critical study of any top leaders in China, or for that matter, there will be no critical study of any leader in China. So all the top leaders, not only Politburo Standing Committee, but also Politburo, you will not know who they are, except what you find a sanitized version. Now, sanitized version, as you know, is a sanitized version. That's never true. It's only partially true. So Xi Jinping is this brave young man who, despite being a princeling and a son of a important leader, he went and struggled somewhere, then saved some peasant somewhere. Maybe some baby was drowning and he rescued him. You know, those kind of stories would be there, and that would be there. But it's like Hollywood celebrities, similar kind of situation. At least with Hollywood celebrities, you have gossip. When they take drugs or something, they're caught, we get scandals come out. In case of China, it wouldn't come out unless it's like Bo Xilai, where the top leadership wants it to come out. And even then they will control what comes out. So leadership change, a lot of hope is made. We think of it. Part of it is we focus on leadership, we don't know the system. It's impossible to study the system closely. It's easier to focus on leaders and try to guess their personality. As if Xi Jinping was really that liberal, let's imagine, he will change. And the argument I want to make it, even if Xi Jinping is liberal, and I think I made that argument last time also here, that even if he is liberal, he would not be able to change. Because if he was genuinely liberal, the system would not have allowed him to reach that level. Because we are not talking of 1 or 2 leaders or 7 leaders. We are talking of a party of 70 million plus. That has to protect its interest first and foremost, and then protect interest of anything else. And one of the reasons we, again, in case of Tibet study, we focus a lot on leadership is our own problem. So when we study Tibet, especially, we always take it back to His Holiness. So everything is about His Holiness, the leadership. So what His Holiness says, does, seems to represent the will of the entire Tibetan people. Now, to some extent that's true. But as His Holiness has himself said, that he is not the most important actor here. It is the Tibetan people living in Tibet, not even you all. Right? So you are secondary. The people living in Tibet, living under actual occupation, are the most important actors. But let's say international community, Tibetans, of course, Tibetans would, out of respect, all the time defer to His Holiness, even when they disagree with him. Because disagreeing with him in public on political matters also can sometimes lead to certain form of social boycott, social bullying by others who will say, oh, you are criticizing His Holiness, so you can't say things, right? There's out of respect. The Chinese blame him and put everything on him because it suits their interest. So they'll never say, this is what Tibetans want. They'll say, it's what His Holiness. Of course, they'll not use the word His Holiness. They'll say, this is what the Dalai clique wants or what the Dalai Lama wants. So they'll also focus on him to demonize him. Now, international community also focuses on His Holiness because it's convenient for them to put everything on him. Now, so even when he has resigned as a political leader, the fact is his words are seen as representing the wider will of the people. That's because he's seen as the leader. And now, of course, increasingly democratic leader, people also pay attention to what Kalon Tripanao Sikyong says, and these things are seen as important. But the fact of the matter is, leaders represent the people in one way or the other. So, democratically elected leaders represent people through elections. So, the legitimacy comes from not from them, but from the fact that they were elected by the people. Or, in case of his own, it comes through other forms of, it's not election, but it comes through other forms of legitimization. That's accepted by the population. But because amongst the Tibetan society itself, we have a lot of emphasis on the leaders, we also tend to imagine that leaders are so important that in China, if leaders say something, things will happen. And something that I remind again and again is, the biggest flaw of this argument on focus on leadership is 1959, the exile of His Holiness, and of course tens of thousands of Tibetans. As we know, the revolt in Lhasa did not start with Lhasa, it had started with Eastern Tibet a few years ago. Now Chinese of course blamed it all on the feudal, aristocratic, monastic and Dalai Lama and all other feudal class. But as most of you would know, the revolt had nothing to do with His Holiness or top lamas or leaders. In fact, they wanted to compromise. They wanted 17-point agreement, most of them, not all, to work. They wanted things to be calm because, like with His Holiness, he believed strongly in non-violence, and he felt that any kind of violent uprising will lead to even more violent crackdown and deaths. So for him, non-violence was more important. But people protested because they reacted to the Chinese rule and Chinese brutality. They fought in the name of His Holiness, but they didn't fight because His Holiness asked them to fight. In fact, it was never the case. Now, reason I mention this is because it reminds us that people in general will do what they think is right. They will use leaders and their name depending on what suits their interest. It's not the other way around. The similar thing is in China. While leaders are very important, leadership change does not imply a significant break from the past. Yes, in the from Mao era, it was important because Mao was an overwhelmingly powerful leader. And the reason for why Mao and Deng Xiaoping leadership was crucial but not any other leadership is because Communist Party has changed significantly. I'll tell you later how it has changed, my view, which some of you would already know. Now, when we look at the changes taking place in recent years, including under the new leadership, critical assessment that economic reforms are taking place, but even if you're a billionaire and if you happen to be a critic of the government, then you were taken out. And China has shown that very clearly. So there are limits to economic reforms and economic liberalization also. All foreign companies have to adhere to Chinese rules. The fact that China has opened up its economy and many foreigners go to China does not necessarily imply China is a more open place or more democratic place. It only implies that more and more foreigners buy into the Chinese dream, which is keep your mouth shut on political reforms and make money and exploit others. That's what's happening. So the idea is that so long as you keep making money, you get you have better life than what you may get in London or New York. So Westerners would also keep quiet. Political reforms would not matter. And today, not only on CCTV, but in terms of Chinese propaganda for foreigners, you'll see a lot of Westerners are involved. A lot of Westerners are involved in rewriting Chinese present. Now, they would not use the language of Great Motherland because they know it doesn't work. So when, for instance, when we read a Chinese writing in here or anywhere else and we say Great Motherland, we know it's a propaganda, right? So they'll never use that Great Motherland. They'll not use the word communist ever. They'll talk of poor nation that has come out of 150 years of whatever. It's opening up as much as possible. Things are slow. Give us time. In any case, West is also in decline, so democracy is not suitable for us because we are too big to be democracy. Now, of course, they never use the Indian example because it's also too big to be a democracy, but it is democracy. With all its flaws, but it is a democracy. So they'll not use it. But economic reforms are allowing the Chinese to incorporate and depoliticize many foreigners. economic reforms are allowing China to leverage its power vis-a-vis UK, France, Germany, Holland, Norway, and increasingly with the US also. What I mean is, with Norway. As you know, when His Holiness went to Norway, no senior government official met him. The explanation provided was, well, it doesn't suit our interests. What was the interest? Salmon fishing, salmon export. Now, remember, Norway is one of the richest countries in the world. It doesn't really need China. It's not a poor country that is dependent on Chinese investment. Even if salmon fishing had suffered, they could still manage. They have enough money. But even they succumb to it. Because they realize that because of Liu Xiaobo and the Nobel Peace Prize, when Chinese had targeted Norway, no other European country stood in solidarity with Norway. So when Norway was being frozen out, Germany, France, Holland, all of them were trying to appeal to the Chinese that we are better partners for you. Similar thing happened with the UK. So David Cameron, he met His Holiness a couple of years ago, or was it earlier 2013 I think, or late 2012. He met him. Now, and of course the Deputy Prime Minister met him. And after that, David Cameron wanted to be invited to China. He was never invited. And it was made clear that even if he goes, the PM and the Prime President will not meet him. So he couldn't. Then last December he went there. He went there with a big contingent of businessmen and all ministers, and they went and they talked of how great Britain and China relationship is, how genuine Britain is in helping China gain more access to market of Europe, and how this is Osborne, who is the finance minister there, so Chancellor of Exchequer. He said, our role, the UK's role, is to highlight China as a great civilization in Europe. You see, the British government present its role as something to help China get better image in Europe. Now what did they get in return? Maybe, okay, he got to meet all the senior leaders, that's it. MOU is signed, we don't know what happened to it actually, whether anything translated into real terms or not. And Global Times, a newspaper there, wrote that don't trust these white people. Britain will come and say how good they are. At that time, Germany will go against China. Then Germans will come in and say how good we are, and the French will go against us. Never trust them, because in the end, UK is good for nothing state, where only we should go to see the Queen, her palace, and maybe study English. That was Global Times. Now, but give that example to show that China is very clearly aware of its power and use of economic power. So economic reforms and economic changes are actually strengthening China and its authoritarianism everywhere and weakening the rest of the world. In terms of international actors, as you know, we have seen with Vietnam and with especially Vietnam and Japan, China is asserting itself. Vis-a-vis India, it's very careful right now. Right now, when you read writings of from China, you'd feel that this new government is the best brother and friend and lover and everything they could ever have. Right? Now, the reason they say that is partially because they'll say that of any government. It wouldn't have mattered. If Congress had come to power again, they would have said the same of the Congress. But there's something in common between the new dispensation in India and the Chinese dispensation. Again, the idea is sideline the politics. Minorities do not matter. Focus on top-down economic reforms and fool the people through nationalism. That is common ideology of the ruling party here and the ruling party there. So Tibetans are being suppressed. Fine, let's build roads. 2-lane road, kill 50 more, build 4-lane roads. That is the Chinese development, that's Chinese pacification. And that's something similar that in Gujarat, that was the model that was being used, and that's the model that's being touted, is that basically infrastructure development is all that matters. Rest will come later. So there is some similarities there. But with India also, when push comes to shove, they'll do what they have to do. But with Southeast Asia, we have seen very clearly with Japan and Vietnam, China is asserting itself and it will assert itself. Internationally, therefore, Chinese are not becoming a better player, not becoming a softer actor simply because they're growing. In terms of political reforms, there is no evidence of political reforms. in China now, rule of law is improving, death penalty has been reduced, but the main emphasis in Chinese rule of law is focus on confession, right? So let's say you get accused of something. The idea is you have to confess. It's not enough to say you don't confess and I accuse you. Of course, Bo Xilai never confessed. So he didn't follow the pattern that was set by Communist Party, which is of confession. This whole notion of confession goes back to even 50s and 60s, when everyone had to confess that they're bourgeois, they're reactionary, they're sorry, and they had to give it in writing. Remember, a lot of Chinese dissidents who fled after 1989, first they went to American embassy or Western embassies, then they went and then they were exiled. A lot of them had to sign confession. Now, does the party really believe that those who sign confession are genuine? No, it doesn't care. So long as you do it officially, so in writing. Something similar. Remember where Dalai Lama has to be denounced in name of patriotic education. Now the Chinese government doesn't really believe that those who write, Tibetans who write against Dalai Lama are somehow against Dalai Lama. But they don't care what you feel from within, so long as in public you make that statement. So face is the most important actor there, not the real substance. They don't want to control your mind. They want to control what you say in public. That's it. In private you can abuse everyone, including Xi Jingping. But in public you have to mind your language. That's how it functions there, right? So rule of law has not worked or is not working because the confession part, that you have to confess, is still the heart of Chinese justice system. Now, as you know, with confession, sometimes you'll confess because you don't want to be beaten up or killed. Sometimes you'll confess because you think you'll get only 5 years instead of 50 years. Sometimes you'll confess because by confessing at least your family is saved. So all those factors can lead to confession. But that's the kind of norm that still exists in Chinese rule of law. Political reforms have not taken place. In terms of anti-corruption, yes, Xi Jinping has been active in terms of anti-corruption, but it's kind of retail corruption that they focus on. No, some officials taking few billions here and there. Some officials having 50 watches that they change every day, which is very expensive, and someone on social media sees it, so it becomes a problem. But no leader has been removed from power who has been in favor of the top leadership and been corrupt. So Wen Jiabao, who was and whose family is well known for being very corrupt, never suffered anything. In fact, he was that grandpa and Uncle Wen, remember in that smiling part. So anything wrong happens, he's the one who goes and cries or whatever and then makes people happy. So that kind of corruption will not be tackled. It would not be. So this anti-corruption drive is largely to target and remind the people that we are doing something, to assure them. But also remind itself, the party, that you cannot take for granted. So be corrupt, but don't be so corrupt that there's nothing except corruption. But the biggest corruption of Chinese state, in my view, and that's the kind of corruption I talk about, is authoritarianism. Even if, for instance, Hitler was vegetarian. This was often used, right? By certain logic, Hitler was a nice guy. Maybe he was vegetarian. Maybe he had pets. I think he had pet animals. Does that change the fact that he was a vicious person whose entire ideology was to dehumanize certain section of population and kill them? Right? That's what he did. And now the fact that he's vegetarian would be unimportant for me, right? So now in this context, the fact that top leaders themselves, let's say Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang and others, may not be taking money and their family may not be taking money, does not imply it's not corrupt, because they are the head of a system that prevents people from expressing themselves and prevents people from being free to express themselves. And that for me is the biggest corruption possible. It's a corruption of soul is something I don't believe. It's a corruption of freedom. So that in that sense there is no anti-corruption drive. In fact, it's a very corrupt system. And also, of course, in terms of economic corruption also, no big changes taking place in China right now. The ideology that the party is using is of nationalism. But are you all you're following me, right? I'm not speaking too fast or anything else. Yes. So ideology of nationalism. Because ideology of communism doesn't work, and they realize that they have something better: money making, consumerism, capitalism. So they have capitalism and they have nationalism. So when you have capitalism and nationalism to help you, why bother with communism? But of course, communism has to be there in principle because the name of the party is still Communist Party of China. Now, nationalism is being used very effectively. Again, best examples are China and Vietnam, what's happening in that context, but very strong sense of Chinese nationalism. So even people who don't like the party, who don't like authoritarianism, will keep quiet so long as it's about Chinese nation. So they'll say, let us not rock the boat at this stage because China is rising. Now, of course, the point is when China is declining, then also say that we should not rock the boat because it is declining. But that's how nationalism functions. Nationalism is, in a certain sense, the most effective form of drug. Marx, or what was it, Marx who said it, or was it Lenin, that religion is the opium of the masses. To some extent it is. I mean, it calms you down, it makes you believe that, okay, don't worry, if something bad is happening, just pray and it will improve. And we have seen some results of that with Tibet also, where that deep religiosity prevented Tibetans from modernizing rapidly in 1920s, 30s and 40s and being unable to face China. Not that if they had modernized, they could have fought and survived, but at least it would have been better than now. But not with any kind of religiosity we see it. But to be honest, religion is much milder when compared to nationalism. Because nationalism is an ideology that will encourage you to kill someone and let yourself be killed in name of something that you have never seen. That's what nationalism is. So nation state, we have never seen what nation state is. So let's say in India, we may want to die for name of India or kill in name of India, both. Normally I might be a very nice person, but in name of country I could fight and kill and be killed. That is the drug of nationalism. In this case, in case of China, nationalism is increasing very rapidly, and more important, it's being increased consciously in order to domesticate the population. Because social changes are taking place, but nationalism is effective to control. And finally, none of the changes taking place in China is challenging Communist Party supremacy. None of them. Because if they had been challenging, they would not have allowed it to happen. Today, people say, well, China would not want economy to collapse, 8% growth or 10% growth to collapse. It would. Because there is no China. I mean, there is no China. There are Chinas. There is a Communist Party and its dominant leadership that claims to represent China. If that involves killing 40% of the population, they would still do it. So long as it suits their interests. And they'll say this is China. The killing of minorities would be justified. Killing of majority will also be justified. All in the name of China or Chinese state that the Communist Party leadership claims to represent. So supremacy is not being challenged. Now, so what we see, of course, in case of China is largely status quo is being maintained. And this is significant for Tibet. Status quo is being maintained. Territorially, China is not going to compromise, will not compromise anywhere. The reason for that is it is believed that why should we compromise? Remember, it gave up Mongolia. Do you know anyone who has studied on Mongolia? Because Mongolia and Tibet were in similar situation, right? How come Mongolia became independent and Tibet didn't? Anyone who has idea? I'm asking you. Anyone who has an idea? Why? How could Mongolia become independent and not Tibet?
Mongolia wasn't part of China. It was part of Russia. Maybe that's what you mean.
See, it was part of Manchu Empire, like Tibet.
Well, at that time, Communist Party wasn't there. So it was different, I guess.
Yes, so one is, okay, there was Russian involvement somewhere.
Yeah.
It was part of China when Communist Party was not there. But see, remember, Tibet was also independent when Communist Party was not in control. But they took over, they liberated, occupied Tibet, but they didn't want to liberate Mongolia. Why? Any other, you're right, so that's part of the reason. Anything else? Any other reason? Tibet was also very religious. Sorry, Mongolia was also religious, very religious. They didn't have that strong army anymore.
Natural resources.
So they didn't have it or they had it? So natural resources, yeah.
Maybe Mongolia hasn't so much, or in the same way they didn't have that.
Yeah. See, basically, so Mongolia and China and Tibet were in similar kind of situation, similar relationship with the Manchu Empire, right? The difference was the Russians went in encouraged Mongolia, they also had Outer Mongolia, Inner Mongolia. So Inner Mongolia remained part of China and Outer Mongolia was autonomous. Now Russians didn't push for independence of Mongolia, but they made sure that Mongolia remains de facto independent, not de jure. Russians also didn't do anything. Now British went to Tibet, as we know, they tried outer inner Tibet, but because of changing politics in London, they gave that up. They didn't really care. Britain also at the same time said, de facto is independent, de jure we don't care. So something similar. The difference, one difference was internal. In Mongolia, communists, so Mongolian communists, not the Russian communists, Mongolian communists learning from Russians very quickly sidelined religious hierarchy, tried to modernize Mongolia, became closer to Soviet Union, and because Soviet Union was friendly with both the nationalists and the communists later, they made sure that the China will not go and occupy Mongolia anymore. So there was an internal domestic reform very rapidly, sidelining of religious hierarchy in very ruthless manner, to be honest, but sidelining of it. Third was when they declared to be independent, and they said to Russia that basically come and take us. Russia didn't take it, but it protected it. So they became an independent country, but a puppet of Russia. Now in case of Britain, India, that did not happen. Partly of course, there was no significant reform in Tibet. No one would say to Britain, and not that even if reform had taken place in Tibet, if that appealed to Britain, Britain would have said, please stay with China because we are not interested. That was Britain's policy. But Britain did not want to upset China or international community over Tibet. Russia had no problem in that. So Mongolia becoming communist enabled them to escape from China. And second was because China was dependent on aid from Soviet Union, even when Mao came to power, they had no option but to accept it. So very similar situation, but different outcomes. Now I say this to remember, at that time China was willing to give up territories that it claimed. Remember, Taiwan still hasn't given up on Mongolia. So Republic of China still shows Mongolia as part of it, right? And who knows, when they come together, and then maybe even People's Republic of China will become more expansionist. But the clear fact is, territorially, now they are in stronger position, so they have seen no reason to give up territory. And as rising power, they focus a lot on prestige and resources, so control over resources, but also prestige. So vis-a-vis Tibet, they see Tibet as something that's humiliating for them. It humiliates them in international community. They're very sensitive about it, and to be honest, then they'll say it's sensitive. You could always, but what is so sensitive? Now, often Chinese will not say it's sensitive. They'll simply abuse the Dalai Lama and deny Tibetans any rights. It's the West that will claim, oh, it is a sensitive matter, we should not raise this. So Chinese are quite good at being strong and weak at the same time. Being very bullying but also vulnerable. Vulnerable up to a point where Western governments say, oh, poor China, we cannot antagonize it, let's be sensitive to it. So they are very much into, because that's their prestige. And also control over resources. China needs resources, Tibet is rich in resources, as is Xinjiang. As you know, majority of population of China lives in coastal areas or central China. Majority of territory of China is Xinjiang, Tibet and Tibetan regions. And therefore they need that to remain a very strong colonial power. Now China, unlike the US, remember China gets its, do you know where China gets its main resources from? Oil and other resources. No, it's basically Africa.
Okay.
Still mainly Africa and Middle East. Okay, Middle East main for oil. So even with Inner Mongolia, Xinjiang, Tibet, all the minerals, China depends heavily on the Middle East, like India does, right? And Africa increasingly. Now, the difference between China and US is, US controls the sea lanes of communication throughout the world. China doesn't. So all the oil that comes via Straits of Malacca, Malacca Strait near Singapore. That is controlled by Singapore Navy, but also US. And then of course you have Indian Ocean. That's also controlled by US, but partly India. So what's happening is, when we look at resource dependence of China, now China is also like US in this context, not using its own minerals fully. You know that US is one of the largest producers of oil. but it doesn't use its own oil. It keeps it as a reserve and gets oil from elsewhere. Now, getting oil from elsewhere implies transportation, but it keeps puppet regimes in Saudi Arabia, Qatar and UAE so that oil prices always kept down. The US is involved in Persian Gulf partly to protect Israel, but that's not the factor. The main reason is to keep control over oil and its price. To make Iran fight Iraq, Iraq fight Kuwait, to make them fight each other, and oil prices sometimes will go up, but in general will be kept down. One as an aside, it's nothing with China, I think, is, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1991, when all this, I know many of you may not have been born then, but it was an important war. And that is, why did it invade? The factor was Kuwait started overproducing oil and bringing down the price of the oil. Iraq had fought 8-year war with Iran. It needed to rebuild itself. To rebuild itself, it's oil dependent. For it, it required oil price to remain stable. Kuwait, under US encouragement, overproduced to bring down the price of the oil. And that's why Saddam Hussein saw it as an act of war. It didn't start with Iraq invading Kuwait. It started with what Iraq saw as an economic war waged by a small Kuwait, encouraged by US, and bring down oil. Of course, in that, before Saddam Hussein had invaded, he had met American ambassador to Iraq, Kuwait, where she said, we have no agreement with Kuwait to protect it in any way. We are neutral when it comes to fights between Arab states, giving indication that we will not be involved. Of course, Saddam Hussein was trapped, they got involved and things changed. Oil prices then got stable again. Coming back to it, now China cannot play that game. It doesn't have that capacity. At best, China can bully its small neighbors and of course occupy and oppress its own people. But it doesn't have the capacity to control sea lanes of communication that's controlled by US. Therefore, China needs pipelines vis-a-vis Russia, Inner Mongolia, but also Central Asia and Tibet. So these minority areas are important for China for mineral resources and to reduce dependence on Africa and other places where it needs to depend on the seas. Now, also with its status as a national increasing, and China is, I've said that in past also, it is a colonizing country. Now, some would say, but China doesn't go abroad to fight wars, right, like US does. And that's true. China doesn't go and occupy a country in Africa and then say, we are bringing you a communist democracy. It doesn't do that. Part of the reason is because it cannot do it. But, as you know, from Tibetan perspective, China is an occupying power. So, fact that, or from Uyghurs also, or Mongols. So, China is a colonial power, but it's a land-based empire rather than a sea-based empire. And this is very important to remember. But in the past also, amongst Tibetan studies and Tibet studies, we've often not used the language of colonization. But that is the language which at least I think we should be using, language of colonization. China colonized Tibet. And part of decolonization is for that to end in certain forms. Now, in terms of military, China is a military expanding, but we can expand that later because I want to close it down now and then have more discussion. Military, as you know, is expanding. There's a certain kind of competition between PLA-N, the Navy, and the PLA. PLA controls the Tibetan plateau, for instance. They need certain kind of trouble there all the time to justify their presence. PLA-N doesn't bother. It wants troubles with Japan and Vietnam and others for its budget to be increased. Now, some would say it's a conspiracy theory. That, military. But look, we all do it. Bureaucracies want to justify their own existence. If we all become, let's say, if we all become like His Holiness, non-violence, compassion, what would happen to all those people who are employed by military? What would happen to all the big industries that produce arms? See, they would not want peace to be there because peace is dangerous for them. Non-violence is dangerous for them. Something similar in China. So if it happened, and you know, Eisenhower, the American president, had warned US and American president warning his own country against military industry complex in late 1950s, saying that our democracy is under threat not from Soviet Union but from our own military industry complex. And that was then. And now, of course, it's much worse. And if it happens in US, why not in China? There is a military industrial complex, and which is of course connected to Communist Party. So they are very powerful. They have maintained status quo. Bureaucracy, something like United Front, which is in charge of Tibet and minority affairs and other things. It has singularly failed to keep Tibetans happy. I mean, remember, one of the job of United Front is to deal with minorities properly, keep them satisfied. All the protests in Xinjiang and Tibet show that they are not happy. So by this logic, United Front should have been removed or at least disbanded. It has failed. But they will not do, because they'll always find ways to blame it on someone else, be it Rabia Kadir or Dalai Lama or some other separatists within. But bureaucracy always perpetuates its own interest. So this demonization of Dalai Lama, which has gone down, you'll have noticed it has gone down now. And the reason for that going down is partly because His Holiness is not giving statements that much about China. That's one factor. Second factor is because they're getting sharper and smarter. Sharper and smarter, I know, because they used to discuss with me also what should we do to counter, this public, but they were polite, public diplomacy of His Holiness. What should we do? I said, what do you do? I said, maybe bring change in Tibet, make life of people better, give them some freedom, allow them to worship Dalai Lama, maybe things will improve for you. But of course, that's not what they wanted. And they now have Western experts who advise them. They realize that criticizing Dalai Lama can antagonize not Tibetans they don't care. It's not good press, right? Saying Dalai, Wolf, everything, it doesn't sound nice. They'll just ignore him. So new strategy is to ignore him as much as they can. That's because the state office, see, the propaganda on Tibet is controlled by United Front. The State Council also has its own propaganda wing. And then Ministry of External Affairs also has its own propaganda wing. So on Tibet issue, all three have certain departments in charge of propaganda. And they compete with each other to get more budgets and more resources in terms of Tibetan propaganda. So they will keep the situation and vested interest, of course. Remember, even if Xi Jingping wanted some kind of accommodation with His Holiness, and I've said that again and again, imagine if His Holiness does go back, right? And many of you go back, who will lose privilege there? Some Chinese and some Tibetans, both. Chinese and Tibetans who are part of the system, the top, they will lose, because you are the guys, or not only you, but you are the guys who know the global system much better than them. Then you are seen as, you'll be more confident because you'll have connection with the US, India. See, imagine, this is of course hypothetical, it's not real, because they're not going to get His Holiness back, I mean the Chinese government. But even if they wanted to, it would imply that good relation with India, because without good relation with India, the Tibet issue would not be resolved. So imagine good relation with India, situation in Tibet, yet there are Chinese leaders and Chinese officials and Chinese businessmen, and there are not many, but there are Tibetan Communist Party leaders whose entire job, livelihood is dependent upon demonizing the exiles. They would not want it to be changed. Imagine if His Holiness goes, what will happen to this the Chinese Panchen Lama? You see, I mean, and people around him, and you can't guess how big an industry the reincarnation now is. I'm sorry, I'm using the word industry here. It's like military industry complex. There's a reincarnation industry complex also, which is of course encouraged by the Communist Party. The Communist Party that denounces religion, that tries to control religion, and then says also generates a certain kind of reincarnation industrial complex. Part of that, of course, a good example is the Panchen Lama, right? The Panchen Lama. Now, of course, those around him, why would they want any compromise, or why would they want any kind of settlement and negotiation, given that they would lose power and authority, and badly, right? They would not want it. Now, they are the ones on whom the current Chinese communist leadership depends. They are the ones who cultivated them. Now you have cultivated, but now you cannot just say, oh, now you are unimportant, we'll talk to the Dalai Lama. Therefore, what's happened is, so this is what I want to say. It's not about leadership, it's the systemic factors in China that prevent any kind of generous accommodation with Tibetans. The status quo is maintained. right? So bureaucracies play an important role, vested interests play an important role, military plays an important role, strong sense of nationalism plays an important role, growing China and the idea, why should we bother, who cares, is also playing an important. All these things make sure that party, and this is how I would like to conclude, the party is no longer a revolutionary party where a new leader could have come and brought about a new revolution. Party is a bureaucratic party. It's leaders are elected through bureaucracy now. So Communist Party has become a governing party and a bureaucratic party. So a bureaucratization has gone on. That is why most leaders you see, the Chinese leaders, they're dull. They have no charisma. Right? Hu Jintao, you cannot be more dull than Hu Jintao. There was no charisma there. But that's what they need, because they don't want charismatic leaders. They want leaders who do some kind of things here and there like Xi Jingping does, but doesn't change or challenge the hold of the party itself. Because Communist Party will not allow any Communist Party leader to consume itself, to destroy itself. Right? Now, agents of change in China could still be possible. So don't want to say nothing will change. It could change. Agents of change could be some leaders, not one leader, some change in leadership. I don't see why. I don't have hope there. Intellectuals, the problem is, as we know, intellectuals are sidelined all the time, but intellectuals play an important role. But majority of Chinese will not know who the intellectuals are, never hear them, because they would be either imprisoned or their voices would not be heard. So when, for instance, even Tibetan intellectual like Wessel, when she is speaking, 99.99% Chinese would not even know who she is. They would never hear her. We know her, but they would not know. Even Tibetans in Tibet would not know who she is, because the party would prevent and focus the energy on preventing her voice to be heard within Tibet or within China, or for that matter Wang Lixiang also. They would prevent that. So we end up with Ai Weiwei, her, few other people, Ilham Tohti, of course no longer, he's imprisoned. He has been disappeared. 10, 12 known intellectuals talking to each other at most. That's a hopeful sign. The worst is, of course, all of them are in prison also. So that is the situation with intellectuals. Students, people talk of young, and I had mentioned that young people, you notice them when you notice Chinese students coming to the West, where they get exposure to what, let's say, even my own Chinese students, a couple of them are quite open-minded and become open-minded. Some of them get even more close-minded because they think I'm attacking them by questioning China, and some of them will change and use the language of the West but retain the nationalism, because nationalism is very common. And what they would say is, I take your point, yes Professor, we understand, right? But China is a different country, you don't know. So all my non-Chinese students will say China is rising, it's becoming important power, and Chinese students will say no, we are not rising, we are not important at all, we have our own problems, please leave us alone. That approach. Now, to some extent, that's shared culture of nationalism. But it's also, you cannot deny the fact that when you hear similar kind of questions coming from Chinese students, wherever you go, you start wondering, is it propaganda that people have bought in? So I keep hearing the same kind of question, oh, you are anti-China and you are anti-whatever, and we are still developing country, how could you expect us to become democratic? So the same question is asked in 10 different countries. So it's also propaganda. So many of them are, in a sense, brainwashed. Middle classes, I have no hope. Because, I was going to give hope to you. No, middle classes also have no hope, because middle classes are the worst consumerists everywhere. They look after their class interest. If democracy suits the interest, they'll want democracy. If it's China style or Chinese authoritarianism, they'll go for Chinese style. Right? So middle class have no hope. Peasants and workers, maybe, who knows, maybe what we need in China is a true communist revolution where workers and peasants throw out the Communist Party and have a genuine democracy. Let's see that. Media, of course, is tightly controlled. So even when changes will take place in China, not in Tibet, no Chinese media, be it state or non-state, private or public, ever goes against the government line when it comes to Tibet or Xinjiang for that matter. Netizens, yes, there are netizens who question the Chinese government on Tibet issue, but most of them criticize the own government for being too soft rather than too hard. So all this, now of course, these are possible agents of change. Now for me therefore, and of course the way in which minorities are seen in China is colorful and grateful. Tibetans, we know all of this, we don't need to go into detail, that Tibetans are meant to be grateful all the time. But there's discussion that's what I call Marong phenomenon. It's not only Marong who's saying it. You know, have you all read about Marong and his views? Most of you? The notion, yeah, little bit. So basically the notion is, look, right now Chinese system recognizes nationalities. 56, right? 55 plus 1, 56 nationalities. It gives privileges to minority nationalities. It gives autonomous regions to minority regions, to minority nationality regions, right? Now, Marong phenomenon. So Marong is a scholar, so and many people like him. So whenever I've been to China in the past, until I'm not allowed anymore, but when I was allowed, everyone said, have you read Marong? I said, yes. What do you think of him? I said, you tell me, what do you think of him before I tell? I have my own views, so give it. Most scholars I've met, and these scholars are Chinese scholars who work on Tibet, Tibetology, have very positive view of Marong, but they'll be very polite because they don't want to challenge the party. Marong's view goes against the Communist Party view. His argument is, why should we recognize minorities as different? We all one. We should all be one Chinese, equal treatment. Because, of course, he'll say we should not discriminate against minorities, but we should also not give them privilege. Because privilege leads to resentment amongst Han, which leads to discrimination against minorities. So the starting point of his argument is, it is privileging of minorities that leads to resentment amongst Han, which then leads to discrimination against minorities. So the blame goes back to the minority for being privileged, not the majority for being prejudiced. Something similar as we know, well, in Indian context with the Hindu right. The notion is, oh, minorities get, Muslims get all these appeasement, they get all these holidays. No, we are all one Indians. Not Hindu, not Muslim, but of course we all Hindu is what they would argue, or we should be converted into Hinduism in certain form, or be killed or expelled. But that is the ideology, that minorities should not be given special preferences. That's Marong view. And Marong, interestingly, uses US example and Indian example to talk of, but see, India and US, they have better minority rights situation and they don't give special privilege to minorities. Quite wrong. When you take example of Jammu and Kashmir, that example, but Jammu and Kashmir, at least in constitution, not in real, but in constitution, India does give special rights to Jammu and Kashmir. Of course, by constitution, even China gives rights to Tibet and Xinjiang and others. But we see very clearly that India is not that different from China when it comes to privileges and non-privileges. But interestingly, those who have challenged Marong and his types in China are those who still then have to end up defending Communist Party. So I have noticed a very interesting phenomenon where Tibetan scholars were defending the government and the Communist Party, and the Han Chinese scholars on Tibet were defending and were critiquing the government policy and defending Marong's view. Because of course Tibetans know that if you give up even autonomy with all its flaws and talk of all Chinese people as one, that would imply complete erasure of identities. So they are, so in certain sense, now my sense is the Communist Party partly encourages this kind of debate. Zhu Weichun, is he still, what does he do now? Is he still in power?
With the religious and minority.
Is he still there? Oh, he'll never go away. I said in Beijing to someone, and it wasn't a good move, but I did say, look, so long as people like him are in power, and he is in power, he is very important for Tibet affairs and negotiation, right? There will be no change, partly because the third part, he is not charismatic enough or he is not powerful enough to go up. So he'll never go up much. But he is not old enough to be sidelined also. So he ends up being given departments where he'll always try to control religious minorities and Tibet affairs. But people like him have promoted this kind of view. There is a thinking. But I don't see China changing very quickly at this stage in time at least. Now in Tibet, and I'll conclude with that, the questions, and I'll leave it with questions. The questions we have to ask is, do we expect positive change in Tibet from Chinese perspective that may make life of Tibetans better, or that may offer hope for negotiations? We can discuss that, because I don't see much hope, but I'm open to being challenged and even corrected. But we have to look at who controls Tibet, which departments, which bureaucracies, which interests control Tibet. How is it being controlled? We know it's military, but also police, surveillance, spy, dividing people, encouraging Shugden worship deliberately when they didn't care, talking of human rights of Shugden worshippers, those kind of things. And sadly, sometimes what we do in exile helps that, because by going very much against Shugden, I'm not talking about His Holiness, because he never goes again. He just says, you can't have me as your teacher. That's it. I mean, he doesn't go and do. But people in the excitement then start identifying people and everything. That sort of falls into the propaganda trap of the Chinese, who then say, well, look at human rights. The Dalai Lama talks of human rights, but he doesn't protect human rights. Tourism economy, I can expand that into question answer if you want, because tourism is one form of control being used very effectively. And we can talk how it's changing. But tourism has existed in Tibet for 20 years, but there's certain new forms of tourism taking place that will ensure more proper means more dangerous colonization of Tibet. So we can discuss that. Tourism economy, reincarnation industry, it will expand. It is expanding, and I think very soon don't be surprised if you see more and more reincarnations taking place in Tibet, because they will try to control through religion, military, of course, different forms of military, and social control. Again, I won't say they encourage drugs, but they make drug consumption more easy in Tibet. I noticed that, at least that's my reading, that they make drug consumption easy. Or they push people into despair, young men specifically, that you have no option but you will take drugs. And then it becomes more and more acceptable. That's taking place. And of course, political control in the end. I know, so there are a lot of questions here, but I'll stop here.